Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Slice of the Reef, our new podcast that demystifies the art of saltwater fish keeping. My name is Billy.
And I'm Giancarlo, aka Banana or Fishy Fish. We're going to be your guides today into the amazing world beneath the waves, but also in the box in your living room. Crazy, huh?
Enjoy and easy reefing.
Hey guys,
All right.
welcome to a special episode of Slice of the Reef today. We are here to talk about zombie clownfish with none other than the creator of them, Robert King.
Hey everybody.
And-
Good to be here. It's my first live podcast, so you'll have to bear with me.
I'm Chris, or Inept, and I guess we also have Billy here with us.
And I'm Billy.
How's everybody doing tonight? Good?
I'm doing well. I just got home.
Can't complain
Yeah.
too much. I think Banana had to run from an exam, and he was saying there was a bit of a drag to get in to make sure everything was here on time. But we got here and we're getting started.
Yeah, we're here.
Oh, okay, good.
Doing it.
We can blame him for being late then. All right, good.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I barely even I thought that it was his fault, really.
Take it. I accept.
And if you're listening after the fact, we were not late. We were perfectly on time to the recording, and there were no
Exactly on
issues.
time.
So don't worry about it.
It was me.
No.
Well,
I'll admit it. It was me.
I'm actually really excited you're here. Very, very rarely do I encounter a hobbyist that has been in the hobby longer than me.
Hey.
I started keeping fish about 34 years ago in freshwater, and I've been reefing for about 30 years exactly. And back in the days before the internet, it's hard to find people who have stuck around since then, because all of these insufferable whippersnappers with all their newfangled gadgets and whatsits. But I have a lot of admiration for people who were reefing before the internet, because they basically had to invent a lot of their own methods and stuff, right? Like, even if it had been invented, or even if people came up with multiple ways to do something, it was very hard to find that information, right?
Yes.
And so even though, like, in the 1960s, 1970s, there were a couple of people who were breeding clownfish. They would basically share nothing. They had very limited success. And there were a lot of people who independently sort of invented breeding clownfish, right? And you're basically one of them, right?
I believe so. I've been here since, well, I've been breeding. I hate to date myself like this, but for 51 years. And I started out, of course, with freshwater, the guppies and the swordtails and things like that,
Classic.
And, I moved on to African cichlids, which I really loved, the mouth brooders. I also had daffodil burchardes, which were some of my favorite fish. They were just gorgeous fish, beautiful. And I really enjoyed doing that. And, I tell you, the first time I bred a fish was I was 12 years old. It was the fancy tail guppies. And one of my first hatches, I got a Siamese guppy. It had two heads. And I was told that you can't keep that alive. It probably won't make it through the night. And I target fed each mouth of that fish and kept it alive for 2 weeks.
Whoa.
And that's what really spawned my interest. Pun intended.
Good pun.
I mean,
That's really good.
someone told you couldn't do it, and you did. I think that'll be a bit of a theme here today.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, I've been told that a few times. Yeah. When I started breeding clownfish, my sister had a store. It was called Jersey Reef Concepts here in beautiful New Jersey. And I was talking to my brother-in-law, and I said, listen, I want that clownfish and that clownfish. And he said, well, what's the difference? I said, well, they're swimming around together, and I'm going to try to breed them. He said, you can't do that. You can't breed clownfish. I said, okay, so I'll take those two. And I bred them. They laid eggs. It took years. Probably took about 4 or 5 years for them to breed, but that was okay. I had nothing but time. I started out with a 15-gallon mini reef, and from there I went to a 90-gallon reef. Gorgeous tank, beautiful. And my clownfish started spawning, and I've experienced some really cool things in the hobby. One of the one of the things I really enjoyed was just being there for the hatches. There was one night that I happened to be there when they started hatching, and of course I'm there with my little flashlight, and I saw a turbo snail up against the glass, and he lifted his shell off the glass, and then it snapped back to the glass, and these eggs just came pouring out of the turbo snail, and there were thousands of them. And then at the same time, the clownfish hatched. And
Whoa.
as they're swimming at the surface, they were eating the snail eggs.
Yeah.
As they made their way over to my collection tube. So that was pretty cool. I enjoyed that.
I think kind of how I got also started in interesting in saltwater is I started breeding freshwater fish as well. And I got super interested into it. And then I started I took a lot of interest in breeding clownfish. And then I didn't have success until 2002 or 3. And I had to actually go into a lot of time and trouble, actually mail handwritten correspondence with a professor from the University of I think one of the universities in Florida. It was a different time for sure.
There's still a lot. There's too many.
I wasn't able to keep any alive for 2 years, and then I figured, well, I live right next to the river from the NOAA laboratory. I said, well, that's a good place to start. Let me go over there and see what I can find out. And I went there and I opened the door and I walked in and said, "Can we help you?" I said, "Yeah, I'm trying to breed clownfish." They said, "Hold on a second." And they went and got this girl. Her name is Bridget Green. You should look her up. She's what a great. She's an extraordinary scientist, marine biologist, and she's so knowledgeable. And she had no problem sharing her knowledge with me. And that's where I got my start. She was my mentor. And I asked her, I said, how do you do this? And she said in her heavy Australian accent, which I'm not going to try to do. I'll spare you. But she said to me, all you need to do is culture Nanochloropsis and feed that to your rotifer culture at 5 parts per milliliter at 27 degrees. And I said, okay. It seemed a little cold, but she was talking centigrade, of course. And then she said, and then you'll take your rotifers and you'll feed them to your larval clownfish at 5 parts per milliliter. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't have a laboratory like she does. I don't know how I'm going to figure this out, but I got to start. I got a starting point. So I got my rotifer culture from Reef Nutrition, Reed Mariculture at the time. I don't even know if it was called Reed Nutrition yet, but from Reed Mariculture, I got my rotifer culture, and I kept them going, kept them alive, and I would feed the hatch. As soon as they hatched, I would feed them. Now, there's an interesting story behind this, and I'll tell you about that. But I would feed them, and then I would wake up the next morning. Half of them would be on the bottom, and the other half would be swimming around. Very few rotifers left. I'd dump more rotifers in there, and the next day, half of them, what was left, would be on the bottom. But the third day, there were none left. And I went through this probably 5 or 6 times. And then one day I said, let me try. I remember reading one little paragraph in Joyce Wilkerson's book, Clownfishes, that talked about co-culturing. I said, well, let me try to feed the rotifers while they're in with the larval clownfish. So I put the rotifers in, and I went to put a little bit of green in, and the cap fell off. I dumped a lot of green. I couldn't even see the fish. I'm like, I said, well, it doesn't really matter because, up to this point, I've lost them all anyway. I just lost another hatch. That's what I figured. The next day when I woke up, they were all alive. They had big smiles, big dimples, happy as can be. And there were plenty of rotifer in the tank. So I just kept feeding the rotifers in with the larval clownfish. I used the co-culturing method, and it worked. Now, here's a story that you will enjoy, I'm sure. There was a problem with misbarred clownfish. Now, back when I started doing this, and probably when you started doing it as well, you were told, or I was told, to cull mercilessly. If the fish had if they had any imperfection, any misbarring, the elongated head or the underbite or anything like that, cull mercilessly. And, I'm not perfect, and nobody culled me. So I figured, well, let me try to keep them all alive. And I did. And And then one day I had a hatch. Oh, let me go back. So I was getting 70% misbarred clownfish out of each hatch.
That is,
and of course, I
high.
Yeah, 70%, right? And now, from what I understand, they were doing studies on this. From what I heard, the story I heard, for 20 years, they had a bunch of marine biologists and doing everything they can to figure out why they're misbarred. They're misbarred in the wild, only in captivity. So they did
Yeah, I
things
remember
like,
that time.
they checked pH, they checked temperature, they checked lighting, they checked the food they fed the food, and every single thing, you know, and they just couldn't figure it out. So one day I had a hatch. I messed up. I missed the day. I woke up in the morning. I'm like, oh no, there's no eggs in the pot. What happened? And they hatched. They all made it into the larval collection tank. I wasn't even there. It didn't matter. They went into the siphon tube. They wound up in the tank. I said, oh no, I didn't feed them when they hatched, which is something that I was told you have to do. You have to feed them when they hatch because they have no egg sac. Well, that's a myth. So I fed them that morning, and 150 out of 150 fish had all 3 stripes.
Oh,
I said, I wonder. So I tried it again. The next time I fed them when they hatched, and I had 70% misbars. And then the time after that, I didn't feed them, all full stripes. Like, this is something. So what I've determined, my hypothesis is they need rest more than they need food when they hatch, because it's a lot of work getting out of that egg. They're tired. They need rest.
That's actually really interesting, because I remember a time when captive bred clownfish, and this would have been the early 2000s, sort of when captive bred clownfish were starting to make their rounds at like the Petcos and the PetSmarts of the world.
Right.
And they had this stigma against them because they had all that misbarring. And I knew people who were keeping like stonefish or frogfish to feed most of their baby clownfish to, because there was this sort of genetic snobbishness, and they were all saying, oh yeah, any clownfish, they just as many of them are misbarred in the wild, but they just don't make it, they're worse. But no, it's midnight snacks. Gotcha.
And they do. Yeah, there are no. I haven't seen any misbars in the wild. Well, I haven't done enough scuba diving to actually be sure of that, but I have not. And let me know when you want to start talking about the zombie clownfish, because that's another story. And I'll tell you the story about zombie clownfish in the wild. I don't think that would ever happen. And then again, I may be wrong, but I don't think that would ever happen, because as you may or may not know, 1 out of 10,000 clownfish in the wild make it, and that's not really good odds. And it's usually the biggest, strongest, or just the luckiest of the batch of the 10,000 that make it. And do you know that they settle within 3 feet of where they hatched? That's amazing.
I assume they got blown like way further away.
Yeah, that amazes me. How do they do that? But yeah, the zombies, however, they're weaker, and I've had this argument with people, and they said that they're inferior. You should cull them. You shouldn't keep them. And I said to them, and I was sticking up for my clownfish, of course, but I said to them, if you want to go for, what would and what wouldn't make it in the wild, well, 1 out of 10,000 clownfish make it in the wild. We've skewed those odds considerably.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So why not? Yeah.
Yeah, no, there's a huge difference. There's a huge difference between sort of pet fish and wild fish. And I mean, I think we may have gone into, somewhat of the speciation, sort of like we did with the dogs, where we have several different dogs from a common ancestor. Now, clownfish are going the same way, right? Where there's all these sort of designer patterns. There's, of course, the zombie clownfish. There's the longfin clownfish. There's lightning maroon clownfish. There's a lot of variations in clownfish, but I think that it's kind of a personal preference at this point. Like, we don't necessarily keep coral in the wild under intense blue lighting. We don't have heavy infrared light or ultraviolet light to make sure all those oranges pop. They'd get eaten immediately because they stand out too much. So I think that the hobby has gotten away from sort of the natural, like the naturalism, I think, of the early 90s. I think that sort of came in when, you had like the Berlin method and you had the Jaubert method, and, they were going back and forth. And I think that everything today kind of evolved off the Berlin method because it was a little simpler than keeping super deep sand beds. And all those guys from that time would say, oh, you can only keep coral with metal halides.
Right.
So I mean, I think that we've kind of come away from sort of the natural white light is best light, only the pure clownfish that look exactly like the clownfish in the wild are any good. But there is certainly a certain amount of inbreeding. But let's start, I guess, with the myth of the week. Every podcast we try to talk about a myth, and then it typically does with the topic of the week. And then we talk about ways to either mitigate or get around that myth. Banana, you want to start us off with
this week's myth, we wanted to do a little close up, something that you're very experienced with. And that's something that people have said that I'm sure you have experience, proof, and, knowledge that goes against it. But the myth of the week this week is that zombie clownfish have bad vision. That's the myth of the week this week, because a lot of the people will say that, well, because they have cloudy eyes or because their eyes don't look normal, they can't see properly either, right? So what are your experiences with that?
Well, here's the thing with zombie clownfish. Now, my first zombie hatch, I had about 30 fish, and they all made it. Every one of them made it up till probably a couple of years old, and then I had to move them into my local fish store for safekeeping. While I was moving, I had to leave them there, and they all perished, which was a shame. I don't know how, but it was out of my control. It was out of my hands. But they made it a couple of years, and they were fine. They were perfectly fine, healthy fish. The thing with the vision, now, if they didn't have like good vision, there's no way they would have made it. As you know, like through the morph stage, if they don't have enough food to eat before they go through morph, they go into starvation mode. They never pull out of it. They don't make it. That's why there's so much mortality at morph. But if they can't eat their 1,300 to 1,500 rotifers a day when they're small like that, when they're babies, when they're larvae, there's no way they'd make it. So they have to have good enough vision to do that, And of course, when they get bigger, they're fine. I have 2 zombies in my care right now that will be 13 years old on April 1st. I'm not fooling. And they're beautiful. They're perfect. They're healthy. They are extremely healthy fish. And the thing that helps with them as well is they're first generation from wild caught. They're genetically sound. They're really, I was a purist as well. I actually had a blue red zebra. I don't know if anyone has done the African cichlids, but the red zebra in the wild, the male is blue. And I paid good money back in the 70s for that blue red zebra. But yeah, I'm a purist as well. They bred the blue out of them. But yeah, I'm a purist. My F1 black Darwins, I have my wild caught black Darwins, and I personally don't like breeding the blacks with the orange. I don't like the mochas. I'll be honest. I mean, I've seen them. I think they're beautiful, but once you go mocha, you don't go back. It's just yeah.
No, once you don't get that bright orange anymore, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you can't breed that back into them. But however, my first generation from wild caught, that's the most sought after fish money can buy. They're not wild caught, so you don't have any risk of disease or anything like that. You know that they'll be fine in captivity. You don't have to worry about that. And they're as pure as wild caught fish. So they are the most sought after. And it really helps, like with all the inbreeding and crossbreeding going on these days, as genetically they just aren't the best anymore. You know what I mean? They do.
A lot of people will buy a pair of clownfish from a single source, and then they'll breed those clownfish. And so now you have inbred clownfish, right? And in order to get a stable breeding population, it takes a lot of very careful genetic sort of husbandry to keep inbreeding from happening in these captive populations. And you have to have something like 32 or so. I used to know the number, but you used to have something like 32 breeding populations. You had to carefully track which offspring were from which and pair them up in order to maintain sort of genetic stability. And people don't do that with clownfish at all. They go to Petco. They grab two clownfish. Yeah, Costco fish. They grab two Petco clowns. They throw them in the tank. They start laying eggs. They start selling those if they can. Maybe they're like, this is so getting a good wild caught clown is really uncommon these days. And getting them to breed is actually I find more difficult. I feel like it's all in the diet, but I do feel like the wild caught ones take a little bit more finesse to get breeding, and I think that they lay a lot more eggs than the captive bred ones in my experience.
Yeah, I mean, most clownfish these days are inbred, from what I've seen. Right? Like, they'll come from the same batch, and then like I said, Petco fish, they'll breed the same clownfish, and those clownfish probably came from the same tank. All right, like those clownfish are siblings being bought to now be bred together. Then it's So now that we're on the topic of the zombie, Robert, tell us about it. Like now that we're on the topic of the zombie, right? Like, tell us about it. What was your first experience or the first time seeing a zombie like?
Well, this is a pretty interesting story. Now, as a lot of you know, my clownfish are 3 years in captivity. My black Darwins, my wild caught black Darwins. They were brought here in 1992. They were released from the pet store in 1994. And I happened to obtain one of those wild caught pairs from a guy who was a pilot. He bought the fish. I used to go look at him I was at the pet store like 2 or 3 times a week. And I go check them out, and they were really beautiful, but I wound up buying a pair of Melanopus instead. But I always looked at the black Darwins. I loved those fish. I thought they were gorgeous. And this guy, the airline pilot, bought them. And then he wound up going through a divorce, and he had to get rid of the fish. And he went to the pet store, and he said, what can I do with these fish? Do you know someone who would take good care of them? And they said, yes, we do. We have the guy for you. And they gave him my number. And he called me, and I got that wild caught pair. Prior to that, I got another wild caught pair that was right down the street from my local fish store. It was a really small, it was a fish store in the guy's house. It was really nice. He had a lot of tanks in there. It was really nice. People would come in and buy fish, and it was great. So I had 2 wild caught pair of black Darwins. Now, the first pair I had from my pilot friend, they were breeding, and they had all black babies, through many hatches, and they're beautiful fish. And one day, the female of my original pair got a little scratch on her head, and I didn't catch it in time. 2 days later, she died from infection. I was devastated. In the other pair, the pair I got down the street, the female was ready to kill her male. He was getting too big, and he was eating out of turn. You don't do that in the clownfish world. So she was dragging him around by his gills. I said, oh, can't have that. So I took that female, put her with the male, the original male, and that's when the magic happened. That's when I got the albino offspring. The hatch, they laid eggs right away too, which is really cool. And the first hatch, I noticed 2 of the fish were just like bright orange. They didn't get black. I didn't keep them alive. They didn't make it. But I always wondered. I'm like, I wonder if were they albino or leucistic? I didn't know what they were. And then the very next spawn they had, I got 30 babies. I'm sorry, 30 out of 70 clownfish were albino, and there was no question, no doubt about it. And I was ecstatic. I'm like, this is really something, So I managed to keep them alive. Gorgeous fish. I have pictures of them in my archives. They're really cool, and I don't know why why I got such a large percentage. It's supposed to be 25% of the offspring would be albino. But now, and here's another issue. They just had a spawn a week ago. The fish did a couple hatch, not many. I believe it's their age. I'm not getting great hatches anymore. But what I noticed in the last few really good hatches that I had, there were no zombies. Now, what I think is that I've seen it. You can see the zombies in the egg form. When you look at the eggs, you can say, yep, that's a zombie, that's a zombie, that's not a zombie, that's a zombie. You can see it. Plain as day. They were picking them off out of the nest as either inferior or maybe non-viable. So they were taking them out, which is a shame. But we may still get some more F1 zombie clownfish. We'll see.
Well, did they not go to high school and learn about albinos? Like, what are they doing killing their albino offspring? Come on.
Yeah, I know. Don't they know they're worth more money?
Well, I've seen some of the eggs, or I guess some of the pictures, and you were also sharing in one of our previous conversations that the albino eggs don't color the same way over time, and so the parents may think those eggs are either infected or not valid, right?
Yes. Yeah, and they don't ever get the silver eyes either, so it's hard to tell when they're going to hatch. Like I have 2 snowflake zombies that are spawning, and when they spawn, it's hard to tell when they're going to hatch. I have to count the days because the eyes don't ever get silver. And you can't see the pupil in the eye either, So I mean, I judge mine by the eyes are silver, okay, but when the pupil reaches 50% of the size of the eyeball, that's when they're ready to hatch. I can't see that with albinos.
So how do you actually condition the breeding pairs? Like, how do you get them to start spawning? Like, if you have a pair of clownfish, they've paired up. Everyone here has sort of paired up clownfish, and some people, I think, they have pretty good luck with clownfish that they've got in their tank. They'll start laying eggs, but some people maybe don't. Like, they don't get as many eggs, or the clownfish sort of drift around the tank. Like, how do you get a pair of clownfish, if you had them, how do you sort of condition them to start spawning? How do you sort of get them going?
Well, that's a great question. I may have an answer for that one. First things first, make them comfortable as you can. Don't mess around with the tank all the time, putting your hands in the tank and stuff like that. If they're not comfortable, they're not going to spawn. Secondly, you have to keep the temperature warm. If they're in a reef tank, it's tough to keep the tank at 82 degrees. I would suggest if you have them in a reef tank and you want to get them to spawn, 80 is the max for the reef. You don't want your reef too warm. But if you're doing a fish only, 82 is fine. I keep them at a higher temperature and I feed often. I don't feed more. I just feed more often. Like if you're going to feed them, if you feed them once a day, some people don't even feed once a day, but if you feed them once a day, take that one feeding and cut it into 4 and then feed them, 4 times a day, smaller amounts. And, I mean, you can increase the amount a little as well. That helps. If they see that there's a lot of food, that will usually get them to start breeding, just like any other species on this planet. If there's food, they're going to breed. So you want to keep them well fed. Also, a good thing to do is take your rotifer culture that you're already starting to culture so you can keep your larval clownfish alive when they do spawn. You want to take those and you want to put them in the tank, sieve some out, pour them in the tank every night around dusk, right around lights out. They see that and they recognize that as food for their offspring. And that will usually get them to go.
Okay. Well, how do you you brought it up, how do you culture rotifers? Like, how do you go about doing it? And a lot of people have a lot of different ways. A lot of people have gut loading. A lot of people will have multiple layers of cultures going on. But if you're culturing rotifers, then obviously you have to culture a fair amount in order to have a series of clownfish and get them through to maturity. How do you go about raising or culturing those rotifers?
Well, I'll tell you, a lot of people will keep a couple 5-gallon buckets full of rotifers. Please don't try this at home, but I keep about a gallon at all times, maybe less, half a gallon to a gallon. No,
and it doesn't.
I was just talking to Chad. No, it doesn't crash. No.
Wow.
I've had the same rotifer culture for 30 years.
All right, so you're just cheating then.
I mean,
100%
yeah, he has
cheating,
the
guys.
cheat codes.
Okay,
He's not.
is he cheating? Chat.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
I do very little to my rotifer culture. I mean, it's like second nature to me at this point. You know, I used to have a 32-gallon garbage can and 3 5-gallon buckets when I had a facility. I was, culturing rotifers and so many. And I've crashed a lot of cultures, especially in the beginning. I've had to buy a couple different cultures from Reed Mariculture. Not just once, not twice, 3 or 4 times. But after a while, I'm like, it's like $100 each time. I got to stop doing it. So what I do is I no longer use heat. And I think that was my saving grace, with you add a little bit of heat to your rotifer culture, and there's, things can go south a lot quicker when you add heat. Now with the
the bacterial sort of competition.
Yeah. And with the large type rotifers, the Brachiotis I was calling them plicatus for the longest time. They're plicatilis. I was mispronouncing it for the longest time. Plicatilis. Anyway, the large type
wrong.
I know. I was saying Brachiotis plicatus the whole time. Boy, do I feel like an idiot. but what I
don't
do
even
is
know what that is, so you're smarter than me.
That's the large type rotifers. And the smaller type rotifers are called Brachiotis rotundiformis. And you'd think with a name like rotundiformis, it would be a bigger rotifer. But no, it's opposite. But anyway, there are different temperatures for different rotifers. The Brachiotis rotundiformis, the small type rotifers, they're good up to 94 degrees. So you might want to put heat on that culture if you have the small ones. If you're culturing small rotifers, if you're breeding larger clownfish, like the maroons or the clarkies or Bisinctus or anything like that, you want the small type rotifers because their larvae are a lot smaller than an ocellaris or a Darwin. So you need the small type rotifers for them. Those you want to add heat. With the large type rotifers, they're good at room temperature. As long as 70 and above is fine with them. Now I feed them.
The fish, right? Yeah.
I feed them twice a day, maybe. That's about it. A little bit in the morning and a little bit, around bedtime. And that's it. And they're fine. The way people crash cultures the most, I know people that cannot keep a rotifer culture alive. And I've given them explicit instructions. This is how it's done. They just, for some reason, can't keep them alive. What you got to do is underfeeding is always better than overfeeding. You overfeed them one time and they're going to crash. Underfeed. They can go 16 days with no food. Do you know how old the oldest rotifer is? I'm going to tell you. It was in the permafrost. In the permafrost, 24,000 years old, and they brought it back to life. I don't know.
Oh wow!
Oh, it's one of those tardigrade situations.
Did they feed it rotundiformis, or do we know the species? Just kidding.
Yes, it was the plicatus, plicatilus, the large type rotifer. Yeah, that was the one.
Names. Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah. So that one lived, but they're pretty hardy. I was always worried about, oh no, the salinity. I think I changed the salinity too quick, and I was told, the people at Reef Nutrition, Reed Mariculture, they're the nicest people, the best customer service. And they said to me, no, these rotifers come from brackish water, where the rivers meet where the rivers meet the ocean. That's where you're going to find rotifers. They're okay with the change in salinity. You're not going to kill them like that, And so I don't worry about that anymore. And I don't do anything. I have an airline in there, no air stone. Don't use an air stone, that'll crash your culture as well. I have an airline in there with bubbles and just so very light flow.
The big bubbles.
And again, big bubbles. I feed them twice.
Maybe that's what I'm doing wrong.
Air stone? Oh yeah.
I have a much bigger container, and I keep them okay, but I never seem to quite get the densities, and I have to sieve aggressively. Maybe because I'm using too fine a bubble.
That'll do it. Yep.
Learning
creates a lot of foam, and the rotifers will come up with the foam. So it's like a skimmer. It's like you're running a skimmer, you're skimming all the rotifers out of the culture.
Well, I mean, you just put a little soap in there. Just put a little soap in there, all the bubbles will pop, right?
Yeah. Try that with the bigger bubbles and let me know how that works.
I will.
I think you'll have better luck. You'll have better luck with that.
Okay, so you keep the clownfish warm. You feed them multiple times a day. You put in a little bit of rotifers towards dusk, which your rotifers can be, the small types can be a little bit warmer. The large types can be a little bit cooler. Feed them once, don't overfeed the rotifers. Okay. So you've got a series of clownfish laying now. How do you capture the fry? Because I've seen all kinds of crazy contraptions. I've got 30 years of experience with people telling me all kinds of different ways to catch the baby clownfish. We know they swim up to the light. There's lots of people who have those spin traps. There's lots of people who will siphon off the whole top of the tank, and they'll have settling chambers. How do you catch baby fry? How do you catch little clownfish?
Well, that's a great question. What I do is I have the siphon tube in the corner of the tank, and I take notice of where the larval clownfish congregate, where they wind up when they hatch, and I usually put the siphon tube close to the corner closest to the nest, and that's usually where they go. And I put a light. What I do is I take it's quarter inch refrigeration tube or RO tubing. The white tubing. You can get it at Home Depot.
The quarter inch sort of John Gust line or whatever it is.
Water line, yes. Don't use airline because airline's not made for water. It gets real slimy, I've noticed. So take the water line, and what you do is you run it through some hot water, and you can get it straightened out. You don't want it to be coiling up on you. And then I use hot water to bend the tube so that it'll sit right in the corner of the tank. It'll hang over the edge of the tank, sit in the corner, and the tube will be right a little below the surface. And then you start a siphon, and you siphon it into a 10-gallon tank down below. You need a sump to do this. Now, as you're siphoning water into the 10-gallon tank, if you do that long, the tank will overflow. So what you have to take, I use like a 3/4 inch line, 3/4 inch tube. I put it into a net with a sponge inside the larval tank. It's kind of hard to explain to you, but I'll do the best I can. I bend the net so it hangs over the side of the tank, and I also bend the net away from the glass. You don't want the net pressing up against the glass, or all the larvae will collect there, get stuck there, get trapped there, and they'll all be gone. So keep the net away from the glass. What you do is you take a 3/4 inch hose, you put it in the sponge, in the net with the sponge. The reason you have the sponge in there is because if you don't, the stuff floating around there will clog that little, I don't know, 1/2 inch, 5/8 inch hole that the tube, where the tube hits the net. It'll clog it and you'll overflow. So with the sponge, you're not getting any clogs. You know what I mean? It'll keep it from getting clogged up. But that little spot, like when the tube is up against the net, it's gonna clog. So I put it in a sponge, and then what I do is I fill the tube with water from the tank into the sump. As long as the tube is full of water, when it's running from the tank, it will maintain that level. So you can run water through it for days, and it won't overflow. It'll just go right back into the sump.
And that keeps the water in the fry chamber the same as the parents, right?
Yes. But when I'm done with the hatch, I stop the flow because you got to keep rotifers in there. So when I'm done with the hatch, I'll pull the tube out, both tubes out, and then, next morning I'll feed. The spinny things, I've tried them. I've lost the majority of my offspring, and when I looked at them under a microscope, their scales were braided, on one or both sides of the fish.
See, I've always found that fry and offspring, you know how you said you put the siphon in like a corner closest to the net, and then you put like a book light or something on the end of the tube, right?
Yes.
And then they get drawn down into the tube into this other 10-gallon tank. It's about at the same level, so the flow is very, very slow. It's not a strong siphon, right?
No, it's a pretty strong siphon. The tank is usually about 2 feet with the parent tank.
Okay. So it's about the same level as so it'll be about at the same level as the sump then.
As the sump. Yeah. Yeah. And then you can raise or lower the tank, or you can raise or lower the water in the sump to get your desired level.
Okay. And then you sort of siphon from the fry chamber from the center of the tank in a net to hold sort of your siphon and a sponge in the net to sort of pre-filter. And then you have another water line from sort of the upper center of your fry chamber into your sump.
That sounds very complicated. I'm not sure if you got that right. I have the siphon tube from the top of the parent tank, right?
Mm-hmm.
The siphon tube from the top of the parent tank with a little bit of a book light. I tape off most of the light, just a little spotlight of the book light shining on the end of the tube. That tube becomes illuminated. And when the clownfish hatch, they see that light and they go for it. They get sucked into the tube, and that tube runs down into larval collection tank. You don't want the end of the hose pointing straight down at the bottom, or else they'll smash their little heads on the bottom when they are collected. So you want to put a little bend on the hose as it comes into the tank. Now, as the water is flowing into the larval collection tank at a quarter of an inch, out of the quarter-inch line, it has to go somewhere. I mean, you can't just let it flow; it'll overflow the tank. So the other 3/4 inch hose goes from the net that has a sponge in it, and from one end is in the larval tank with the net and the sponge. The other end goes into the sump. Now, when you fill that hole with water, it makes a bridge. Water seeks its own level; it'll stay at the level of the sump all the time. Unless you lose siphon in that hose. Don't lose siphon in that hose.
Well, no, you gotta get a flood.
You want those?
So you have a self-leveling clownfish larvae refugium. That's really cool.
Exactly. Thank you. I couldn't have said it better. That's what I have. Yes.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if you guys have seen my tanks lately. I've been making new tanks. I tried to build my own tanks just to get the size, because they're custom. They're custom size. If I were to go out and get them made, it would be thousands of dollars. I'm not going to do that. I make my own. Now, if you see the tanks that I have now, they are full of clownfish. I've probably got, I don't know, maybe 800 baby clownfish that are all 1.5 to 2 inches. And I have about 400 fish in a 44-gallon tank that are over an inch. Some of them up to 2 inches, 2.5 inches. Now, you're probably saying, how is that possible? Now, don't try that at home either, because you shouldn't keep 400 fish in a 40-gallon tank. But what I did was I invented a filter, which is, it's just really, it worked so much better than I anticipated. I didn't know what I was doing at the time. I said, well, I have to try something. And I'm always trying different things, to see what kind of results I can get. And what I did was I took this char. It's a charcoal, not activated carbon. Activated carbon is a different animal. It's a charcoal that will actually house bacteria. So this char chamber, what it does is it's a sponge filter, and I built the chamber for the top of it, and I did it in a way that it brings food and air up into the chamber to feed the bacteria. Now, the char, as you know, will polish the water. It'll take impurities out of the water. The bacteria, it thrives so well with this particular type of char that I have that it becomes like bacteria factory. It produces so much bacteria. It becomes has a probiotic effect. And I've noticed such a difference with this char chamber in babies with larval fish. Now, you guys know about the morph stage of the clownfish and all that. They go through that morph stage where they just stop eating. They just kind of float around, and a lot of times if they don't have enough fat on them, they will go into starvation mode, and that's where you have your mortality rate. That's where you lose the most fish. Now, with this char chamber, I put one in at day 3 in my black Darwin baby tank. On day 3, I put it in the tank with the babies. By day 5, I had head stripes, which is something I have never seen before. And they never went through the morph like they normally do. They never slowed down, not for a minute. They just kept darting around and eating like crazy, and it was amazing. And 100% survival, which is also pretty incredible.
That's
I was getting
unheard of.
Yeah, I was getting very low survival rates because And I'll tell you, I'm not the best at keeping my water parameters, straight. I get high nitrates because I'm doing dense feedings. I have a higher temperature, and the nitrates sometimes they get away from me. And when the nitrates get really bad, I was starting to lose fish. I'd keep like maybe 10 out of 100 fish at one point. I'm like, this is terrible. And then
and you have to keep that high concentration of rotifers, which you're feeding anyway. So you can't really, no matter, you can't get away from it. Like you can't even do this in a huge tank because then you have to have more rotifers. You have to feed them even more. So you're still going to have runaway nitrates, right?
Yes. And a good rule of thumb for how many rotifers to put in your larval tank, it's one rotifer per fish length. Whether you have 500 baby clownfish in there or one baby clownfish, one rotifer per fish length. It's a good rule of thumb. If the fish has to travel further than one fish length to get its next meal, it's going to expend. It's going to use expend more energy than it consumes.
Okay, so you want at least so you need a lot more rotifers when they're small because the fish length is so short.
Well, yeah. I figured one rotifer for every
much, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, for every quarter inch. If you get like a nice hatch of like 200 or 300 clownfish, well, they'll consume half of the rotifers you put in there on day one. And then when you dim the lights, don't ever leave the clownfish in the dark either. Dim the lights at night. They'll stop eating and the rotifers will double in quantity. So you wake up the next day to the same amount of rotifers and then they'll do it again.
Co-culturing. It works like magic.
Co-culturing. Yes, but do not, and I can't stress this enough, do not ever put your clownfish in the dark. If you want to try it, turn your lights out and see what the clownfish do when you do that. They will go straight to the bottom, roll around a few times in their own feces, get it all caught up in their gills, and they won't make it.
And there's there's oxygen down there. There's a lot of dirt. Okay.
Yeah, a lot of waste. But don't ever leave them in the dark. I've had that happen where a light went out and I woke up to a tank full of nothing.
Oh, it's terrible.
Yeah, it really is. Really is. I have a lot of clownfish blood on my hands.
I mean, I used to work in an oyster hatchery, and the number of oysters that I have put on spat and the number of oysters that I've had to flush down the drain are probably both in the millions. It's just it's a different kind of husbandry when you're dealing with marine or wild species that do this sort of broadcast kind of spawning because the numbers are so boggling, right?
Oh yeah. Now, oysters eat bacteria, correct?
They'll filter it out of the water, yes.
Yeah,
and then they'll consume
it, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool.
Yeah, so this char chamber, good.
Yeah, I was just going to get back to that. The char chamber, I originally made that for a quarantine tank. So I set up 2 quarantine tanks. I had 2 char chambers running, and I had 6 storms in each tank. Now, I was doing dense feedings, like 6 times a day, just feeding them. And for 8 months, I never did a water change. And those fish thrived. They were beautiful. They just thrived. I've never had healthier fish. I'm like, this is really cool. So one day I'm looking at my larval collection tank, and when day 9 is when they start dropping. I'd see 5 or 6 on the bottom, and then next day it'd be 10 to 15 more on the bottom, and then but by day 11 or 12 they'd all be gone, except for maybe a handful I'd be able to keep alive. Every time I checked for ammonia, I didn't catch it until it was too late. So I put an ammonia badge in there, which I really don't have much faith in, but they work. Well, I should say
they're good indicators. They're good indicators that you should check something. They're not necessarily great telling you exactly what your levels are.
Yes, exactly. So what I did, I put that ammonia badge on there, and day 9, I happened to look over at the larval tank. They were on day 9, all still alive. I'm like, okay, that's cool. And I looked and I saw the badge came up to alert. It has safe, alert, alarm, and then toxic. So it went up to alert. I said, oh no. So I grabbed the char chamber out of the black storm tank and I put it into the baby tank. Within 1 hour, it went from alert back to and stayed there. I was doing a gallon a day water changes on my larval tanks, a gallon a day. And I'd have 6 or 7 tanks going at once. That's a lot of work,
Yeah.
A gallon water change every day on every tank. It was a real pain, and I was still losing fish. So when I introduced the char chamber, I never did another water change on a larval collection tank or on a larval tank, period. I'd have them in there for 6 to 8 months before I put them in grow out. And I don't lose any fish. No water changes. Zero.
Yeah. You siphon the little crud out of the bottom, or you just
once a week. Once a week. And another thing I noticed is that crud on the bottom, if you've done this before, you scrape it up and it's like sticky and nasty.
Yeah, it's like mud.
Like mud, yes. With the char chamber, when you go to try to scrape that up, it just starts blowing all over the tank. It's not a steep, nasty mess.
So so you have bacteria that have colonized the sponge and then the porous carbon, right? And they're doing a lot of nutrient processing and exfiltration, so the sludge will become a lot less dense and kind of toxic. That's good.
Yes, it becomes less dense as it's in the clownfish's gut because of the probiotic effect that it has. It's utilizing all the food that the larval clownfish and the clownfish fry and the adolescent clownfish. It's utilizing all the food. It's down all the food that they're consuming. Therefore, they're getting so much more bang out of their buck. They're getting all the nutrients out of the food, and I've noticed that they eat so much more ravenously with the char chamber than without. And the waste is not, and you can see, the waste is not as dark brown or and it's not sticky. It's not nasty.
I mean, I'd imagine with the nitrates and stuff staying down that it's also, fish smell, right? So it's also, I guess, better smelling to them, so it's not gonna affect their appetite as much.
That could be, yeah.
I mean, that's just a thought. I don't know. I've done no science on the matter and how much fish smell.
And how do they, how good is their sense of smell? I don't know.
Yeah, sure. I've kind of controlled the conversation from our side, and I'm sure Banana or Billy have questions at this point. I've had a lot of experience breeding clownfish back in the day. I haven't done anything lately, so I definitely would like to talk to you about maybe getting a couple of your char chambers. I know you sell them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I might reach out to you for a couple of clownfish and a char chamber here because I'm thinking about starting breeding again just for the hobby. But I'm sure at some point I should stop hogging the microphone and let Billy or Banana talk to you.
You just ask better questions because you've also done what's the term? Aquaculture.
I'm so boring.
Nah.
No, not at all. Now,
well, okay, so
have you
say he got those 2 clownfish.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say he got those 2 clownfish.
Yeah.
How do you take a pair that you want the traits of and kind of build it into a stable, genetically diverse line of clownfish? That's what I'm curious about.
Well, the thing with my first generation, my F1s, they're as pure as wild caught. So, I mean, if you have a storm, for example, they're inbred many, many times to get that specific phenotype. So if you want to clean the gene, you can breed one of my F1s with the storm and still have a lot of clownfish with the storm phenotype in them, but they'll be a healthier version. You're cleaning the gene almost. It's instead of inbreeding more.
Yeah,
you're putting a cleaner gene in there, and it makes for a healthier fish. As like people say, the life expectancy of a captive bred clownfish is 10 or 12 years, and that may be so when you get your F97s from Petco. I shouldn't say
97s.
Some other store
from your local fish store chain.
Your local fish store.
Yeah.
I like to think of them as fighter jets. They're F-22s or F-35s.
Yeah,
we are fighter jet fish.
Yeah.
it's probably safe to say that they'll live 10 or 12 years, and that's it. You're not going to get 33 years in captivity and still breeding from an F97. You're just not going to do it.
Yeah.
So yeah, introducing an F1 is always good in any scenario. I mean, you can inbreed my F1s together, which is not so bad. You have an F2, which is still a very healthy, genetically sound fish. It's when you start getting to the 6, the 7, and so on, that they really start to be compromised. So you have to be careful.
It's called in engineering tolerance stacking, right?
Yes. Have any of you ever bred any other types of saltwater species?
I did a bit of work with oysters. I did a bit of work with clownfish. I would love to go back and try to bring back the original lightning maroon look when just the stripes were lightning. It wasn't just sort of a modeling on the side of the maroon clownfish. I did a little bit of work with the NIH for their Zebra Danio program, and they were doing sea bay clownfish for a while. I got curious with trying to breed like the dottybacks and the gobies, but once I started getting eggs, I then had children of my own, and I got a little bit busy. So I abandoned my breeding efforts about 10 years ago, and talking to you is really making me miss it for sure.
You had other breeding things going on.
Yeah.
I wasn't gonna say it.
Yeah, so I've managed to breed a few different species. I have a blue thumb. I can't keep a plant. I can't keep a plant alive. But when it comes to fish and other types of saltwater, any kind of fish really, I have a blue thumb, and I don't know. I guess I'm a water person.
Yeah.
I noticed that there are people who are water, and there are people who are land people who love to go hiking, and there are these crazy air people that love to jump out of airplanes and stuff. I don't know, but
bungee jumping. What's that about?
But they don't get why I jump out of a perfectly good boat either. But but I have bred. I was actually the first one in this country to breed the mandarins, and that I enjoyed that. That was so cool. I never got them to full size, but I was able to get them to spawn. I was able to collect their eggs with tails at that point. They hatch in 12 hours. They spawn every other day, and they hatch in 12 hours. So I had a lot of chances.
Yeah, the math, once you get a pair of small breeding fish from the reef going is astronomical. Just the number of, and that's one of the things that's contributing to the genetic like line breeding, where you have the same kids of the same parents, is that it's so difficult to maintain a demand for multiple breeding pairs. Right. So when you have like a breeding pair of clownfish, and you've got you're talking crazy numbers, because you feed your clownfish so well, and you're taking such good care of them, and you've had them for such a long time, and they have that stability and that comfort, and you're talking they're laying way more eggs than some other breeding pairs, and you have the husbandry of the rearing down, so you're seeing 95-100% success. So you, from just 1-2 breeding pairs of clownfish, will come up with hundreds, thousands of offspring, and sort of doing the math like that, it's hard to get rid of that many fish. And when you add, okay, well, now I need to have 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 pairs of breeding clownfish so that I can maintain sort of genetic diversity across my lines. And then every line that I want to maintain for my Solaris, for my maroons, for my Clarks, for my zombies, right? I have to do 30 pairs. The numbers get away from you very quickly.
Oh yeah. I've seen it happen to a few people, and they're just overwhelmed by. I mean, you can't get rid of them all. You just can't. I am starting now to be a little more responsible. I have a lot of fish. I'll get rid of them. It's not a big deal. I haven't taken a hatch in a long time. I may take my next hatch. It's the extreme blue spikes. Just because I don't have many of them left, but I've let a lot of spawns go, a lot of hatches go, because I just it's pointless to keep them all alive, because what are you going to do with them?
Yeah. What is it, about 2 years from spawn to when they're paired up and laying eggs, roughly?
About 2 years. Yeah. Well, some of these people that run these facilities, like ORA, for example, they'll get a pair to spawn. Their females are old, and their males are old, and they're spawning. That takes.
They've got to be feeding hormonal food at that point.
I can't speak to that. I don't know for sure, but I do know that they are feeding all day long, and they have the means to do that. They just they run the water right from the mangrove, from the mangroves forests there, whatever they just run it straight in, through UV sterilizers and all that good stuff, and
Yep.
and they have a constant supply of fresh salt water.
I
So they can
see.
feed.
Yeah, so there's no
feed.
there's no water changing or anything. Interesting.
Temperatures are 84 degrees
Hmm.
when they're growing out, stuff like that. You can grow them real fast. But, there's another thing I wanted to touch on real quick. You talk about other types of larval collection, like the spinny thing, and people like to pull the pod out and hatch manually. And, like I said previously, I used to do African cichlids, and I would take the eggs from the female. I'd grab her, I'd pull her bottom lip open and shake the babies out, and every one of those offspring became egg-eating fish. And I noticed there was a big rise in egg-eating clownfish. And I'm thinking it maybe there's something lost, in the maternal instinct. When they're not being hatched by their parents, they lose something there. Just like with the cichlids, same thing. So that's why I don't like to pull the pod out and hatch them. I feel that they may lose something there, and a lot of people talk about, my clownfish eating the eggs. Yeah,
That's actually very interesting, because I went to the Sea Aquarium in Singapore, and one of the things that they're doing is they're breeding groups of clownfish, and what they're working on is having harems again, as opposed to pairs, so that by the time the fish have their chance to be the male and female, they will have seen a couple of spawns. Right. So there'll be a male and a female spawning, and they'll let a bunch of fry loose in the tank, and it's really funny because they have like koosh balls for anemones. Right, they have those little plastic like noodly like koosh balls. They don't have anemones in there, right?
Guys, if you can't afford an anemone, just get a fake one. The clowns don't know. Just make sure it's reef safe.
Store-bought, if you can't make your own, store-bought is fine, apparently.
Exactly. We have anemones at home.
So they'll have like 4 or 5 clownfish in a breeding tank, and then they will take a pair out from that once they've seen a couple of spawns, and they're doing that to see if that reduces the amount of egg eating. I haven't read the paper yet. They were doing this research in 2024, so I don't even know if they're published yet. But it was an interesting thing that I saw that they were doing while I was there last year.
That is interesting. And if you get a hold of that paper, if you would pass that on to me, that would be great.
I will, and I'll also send you a bunch of pictures. The cleanliness of their laboratory is a little off-putting.
Not like my off-putting.
Not mine like either. No, it is an aquarium, so they have a full-time staff, and it is a display area. So they have people taking tours, like I was taking tours, and they have people looking at, like when you go to a museum and it's got the glass wall, and it's like, watch the archaeologists clean off the dinosaur bones. It's like that kind of fish breeding lab. So like they're doing everything for presentation as well as function. So the cleanliness is off-putting, but I will absolutely send you a list of pictures and we'll talk about it after this. Do we have do we have more stuff to cover, or is it time for the fish of the week? Banana, what do you think? Did we lose? I haven't heard from him in a minute.
I have one more to talk about, but I just forgot what it was.
Go ahead.
So go ahead.
What's up?
What else you got?
So if it comes
I
up later, we can splice it in.
I think it'll definitely come up. Yeah. Yeah, no, we definitely, we talked about water changes and feeding and culture and eggs and spawning and pairing off.
Eggs.
We talked about eggy. Eggs. There we go.
Eggs. Thank you. People ask me all the time, how do I get my clownfish to stop eating their eggs? And this was something that was, and you know, and I'll tell you, when I go on other like forums and chats and things like that, and I just see people say, "Hey, do your research," I cringe because that's why the people were there. You know, it's a form of research by asking questions in these forums. That's a form of research that just drives me crazy. That's why my page, I don't ever do that. You know, it's like you have a question, you ask it, and I'll answer it to the best of my ability. I'll never tell anyone go do your research because that's why you're there. So that being said, with the egg eating clownfish, people ask me, how do you stop them from eating their eggs? And I had that problem with my breeding pair of extreme blue snow onyx. They kept eating their eggs. I'm gonna do. And then I talked to Matt Wittenrich. You guys know, no, I'm sorry, not Matt. I'm sorry, Matt Wittenrich. Matt Peterson. He's the guy with the lightning maroon. You know, he got the first lightning maroon from the wild. And I talked to him about that. And he said, there's something missing in the fish's diet. And the eggs have that thing that's missing. So what you want to do is you want to feed them eggs. So I go and I get, I went and I got the roe from Reef Nutrition, real oceanic eggs or whatever that.
Yeah, they're like stripped oyster. Yeah, stripped oyster larvae, I think, isn't it?
I'm not sure what it is, but yeah, I mean, any kind of lobster eggs, oyster eggs, any of those types of eggs will work. But I started feeding the roe, and like within 2 weeks, they stopped eating their eggs. Like the very next spawn, they didn't eat them. But that doesn't work all the time.
I'd be interested to see because there might be like DHA or something in there that they're after.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Some type of protein that they're missing in their diet, which I thought was pretty cool.
Okay.
I would be worried that it would make it worse, but yeah, if there's an actual deficiency that they know they can get from the eggs, I guess they're smarter than I thought. Slightly smarter than I thought.
They are smart. And I want to tell you a quick story before we get off. Before we get on to the other, the fish of the week. Clownfish, and a lot of people don't know this because they don't actually pay that close of attention, or they just didn't happen to be in that place at that time. But clownfish, they have I'm trying to think of what the word to use. They have compassion. They're compassionate. People don't ever see this. But I had a pair of clownfish that they succumbed to new tank syndrome. I went into the facility in the morning. They were laying on the bottom, breathing heavy. I'm like, oh no. I pulled them out of the tank and I put them in a standalone 10-gallon tank with an air stone and a heater. And I started feeding. The female wasn't eating. And I just happened to, like, after about an hour, I glanced over and I just saw her just like fall over. She was laid on the bottom. I said, oh no, she's not going to make it. You know, I was devastated. The male came over and with his nose picked her up off the bottom and held her against the glass for 2 weeks. When I fed that tank, the male will come over grab the pellets from my hand and from his mouth to her mouth. He would feed her pellet by pellet for 2 full weeks, and she made a full recovery. Most people don't ever see that, so they don't know. You know.
Yeah, no, that's amazing.
Yeah, I was so glad I was able to witness that. You know, it was cool. All right, what's the next thing on the list is the fish of the week.
Sure. Yeah, every week after we've done sort of our talk, like, so we do our myth of the week and then we discuss the myth of the week, and it certainly is a little more complicated than maybe some of the freshwater fish, but it is absolutely doable to breed saltwater fish, clownfish, several other kinds. But we have a fish of the week, and you have a very special and particular fish that you chose for this week's Fish of the Week.
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And Scott is going to get his a spot in the limelight here.
His day in the sun.
Scott is a spot. His day in the sun. Scott is a sand butterfly fish that comes up with the Gulf Stream every year from Florida, the Keys, down in that area. Comes up with the Gulf Stream, not fin butterfly. Now, when he gets here, he was about the size of my thumbnail when I captured him. And I really did save that little fella from the reef because they don't ever make it back. They come here, they eat, and by the time they decide to go back, it's already too cold and they don't make it. They just don't make it.
Yeah, no, it's pretty far north for them.
Yes, it is. Beautiful fish, though, gorgeous. And I was diving on a wreck one day with my friend Gary, and I watched him. I was observing him swimming around with his little red catch bag opened up. He's swimming around and going to the left and to the right and just all over the place. I didn't know what he was doing, so I went up next to him to see what he was doing, and I saw he was chasing a little spot fin butterfly. And I had a big yellow catch bag, and I opened it up wide, and that fish just swam right in my catch bag. So I gave Gary the thumbs up and the OK symbol, and we went to the surface. And he said, that's okay. I was going to give it to you anyway. And I took it home, and people told me there is no way you can keep that fish alive in captivity. You just can't do it. There's no way.
How long ago was this?
10.5 years ago.
Yeah, no, at that time, butterfly fish were mythical. They couldn't be done.
Yeah. Well, and a wild caught one.
You and your blue thumb.
My blue thumb. But so I brought him home, and people actually said to me, "There's no way you have a spot fin butterfly fish at your house. It's just impossible. You're lying. The truth isn't in you. You can't do it." And I said, "Well, I got pictures. You want to see the?" "Oh, no, you're lying. It's photoshopped. Like, you want to go to my house and see the fish?" No. They wouldn't believe me no matter what I told them. So 10.5 years later, this spot fin butterfly fish is one of the most beautiful fish that I've ever had. Really pretty fish and healthy as can be. Now, he was the size of my thumbnail when I caught him. So when I brought him home, of course, I fed him newly hatched brine shrimp. And that was about it, until he got a little bit bigger. He started eating pellets. Was his first pellet food. Tore it up after a while. I had him in my reef tank until he started eating all my polyps. And so I had to get him out and back in the with the fish only. And he's just been doing really well up until a couple of weeks ago. And he went into starvation mode. His belly got real thin, laying on the bottom, breathing heavy. And I said, "Oh no." And I scooped him out and I put him in a standalone tank with a heater, an air stone, and a char chamber. And I started, so I started, feeding. And what I fed him, that the thing that really brought him around was Aptasia that I have in my black Darwin tank.
There you go.
My Darwin tank is overrun with Aptasia. And I took the flower pot out of that tank that was covered in Aptasia. I put it in the tank with the fin butterfly, and that's when he started eating again. And now he's fat as can be, eating up a storm, doing really well. 10.5 years later, he's doing really well.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's butterfly fish in captivity. That's a long time, especially one that was found so far outside of its range, right?
He's older than Banana already. That's impressive.
It's very impressive.
I didn't know.
Oh, no, I'm kidding.
I didn't know it was hard to keep. If somebody told me, no, actually. People
it seems it seems like the way to get you to do something is to tell you can't.
It can't be done. That's right. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, it absolutely cannot be done. But I really wanted to thank you for coming on when they asked me to start hosting. I'm a little bit new here, but I have a longer perspective of the hobby. I've been around a long time. And I know that when they said, "Hey, is anybody you can think of who you would like to get on as a guest?" I absolutely thought of you immediately. I've been enjoying some of your streams on Facebook. So if you have Facebook, check him out at Robert King's Clownfish. I know that you have your own website at zombieclownfish.com.
Yes.
And from that website, there are a couple of different things like, your shop and your gallery and contact us. I know that you do sell some of your fish. You do sell your char chambers. Is there anything else that I'm missing? Is there anything else you'd like to shout out while you're here?
Yeah, absolutely. Every now and then I do these events on my page on Robert King's Clownfish, and they're usually to benefit other people. I have done events for my webmaster, my web designer. Needed a new computer, and so let's do an event for you. We did the event, and we got some money, his computer, and everything was great. And I did one for my sister. I did one for my admin, and and it's always a great time. And and like mid event, people will say, "Hey, I want to donate this." Just more things will be added. And I always say, the more memberships, the more prizes. It's a lot of fun. It usually takes a couple hours to go through the whole thing.
Yeah.
You don't have to be there to win, which is cool too. So thank you for asking me that, Greg.
Absolutely going to go to that. And you absolutely didn't prep us ahead of time, but I'm glad I asked.
There you go.
Yeah, no, I used to really like watching, especially during the pandemic. I used to watch a lot of your Facebook streams.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Anything else, Billy, before we let Robert King back to his evening?
I don't think so. That's all the questions I got.
All right. Anything from chat before we let him go?
Oh, we did have one question from chat. Weiss asked, before the internet, who would you ask a question to? Like when you had that two-headed fish you had, how did you figure out what to do?
Well, as I mentioned before, I had to go over to the NOAA laboratory. And again, Bridget Green, Greene. If you do a Google search on Bridget Green, she's in Tasmania. She is a wealth of knowledge. I mean, she did her thesis on breeding clownfish, and she's in Australia. So that's where I got a lot of my information from. I tried asking people and they were so tight-lipped, nobody was sharing any secrets, which is why I do my Robert King's Clownfish page. It's because I don't want anyone to have to do 2 years to get a larval clownfish to live. I know that there's a lot more information on the internet now, and it is a little bit easier, but I can show them what to do. Anybody what to do if they want to do it. And I always say, if you do what I do, you get what I get. And I want to thank you guys for having me on here. I'm honored. To be a part of this.
I wouldn't go so far as to say honored. I think that you're doing us too much credit. You're definitely one of the legends in the hobby. You've been around. I think everybody. There's only a few people I know that nobody has anything bad to say about, and you're one of them. Thank you very much for coming. And that's basically all I had. Banana, Billy, anything else?
Really? No, nothing too much. Just really appreciate you taking the time to come on with us. I know we started a little late, but we're finishing the best way that we can. And as always, your information is it's crazy. I mean, you are a book, an encyclopedia of information. And when it comes to clownfish breeding, you being one of the forefront people that kind of help give that the push with your work with the Zombie Clownfish and with the rotifers and the way that you've kind of redesigned the fry catching technology that you have, even with the carbon chamber, is massive. And so we're just really grateful to have you on. For those of you that are listening, for those of you that are listening else afterwards, we encourage you to take part in the event. If you really want to see more, and I really encourage that you do, you can always find Robert King's Clownfish on Facebook. It's a really welcoming community. His live feeds are awesome. His audience is great to interact with as well. And his website is zombieclownfish.com. If you want to check it out, I'm posting it in the description below. That's zombieclownfish.com. And again, the Facebook is Robert King's Clownfish. Thank you so much for Robert for being here with us. Billy, Chris, enough? Do you guys got anything?
I guess Billy's got to say his magic line.
Spoil it, dude. Don't spoil it. What if it's their first time?
No, some people's got to hear
what's the
magic line that we wrap up all our podcasts
Thank you for coming. Thank you, Robert King, for sharing your time with us. We'll see you guys next time, and easy reefing.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Slice of the Reef,
your number one podcast for all things fishy, with your hosts, Giancarlo and Billy. Make sure you subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that podcasts are held. That way, you'll never miss an episode. If you want to be a part of our podcast, join us on discord.xyz/Slice of the Reef, where we'll be recording in front of a live audience. We also give you a moment at the end of every episode for a live Q&A session, and we're very interactive with our fans. So we'd love for you to join. You can also check out our website for articles, guides, calculators, and information on our upcoming episodes at sliceofthereef.org. Hope to see you guys soon.
Farewell and easy reefing.